What does it mean to be declared dead while still breathing? There are moments when a life seems to vanish without a trace. A canoe found shattered on a cold shoreline. A pair of shoes left neatly on a beach. A car burned so completely that nothing recognizable remains. These scenes carry a strange finality, convincing us that a person has crossed a boundary from which there is no return. And yet sometimes the boundary is an illusion. This story begins not with a single disappearance, but with a question that has quietly haunted modern society. Can a person truly erase themselves? Not metaphorically, not emotionally, but legally, socially, and psychologically. Can someone step out of their own life and watch it continue without them? For centuries, death has been the ultimate certainty. It ends stories, closes accounts, and freezes memory in place. Communities mourn. Families reorganize their lives around absence. Paperwork is filed. Names are carved into stone. Death, in its finality, gives shape to grief and meaning to survival. But in the modern world, death has also become something else. A status, a record, a declaration made by institutions that trust what they can see and verify. That trust has been tested. Across recent decades, a quiet pattern has emerged. Ordinary people, professionals, politicians, parents, and criminals have attempted something radical. They have tried to disappear while leaving behind just enough evidence to convince the world they are gone forever. Their motives vary. Some are cornered by debt, some by scandal, some by fear of prison, others by the slow pressure of lives that no longer feel survivable. What unites them is not courage, but calculation. To fake death is to perform one last role with absolute conviction. The timing must be precise. The evidence must tell a story that authorities already understand. Water must be dangerous. Fire must be final. The body must be unrecoverable. These are not accidents. They are carefully staged narratives designed to exploit our assumptions about how death behaves. In each case, the world responds as it always has. Sirens cut through quiet towns. Search helicopters trace slow arcs over water. Reporters arrive with microphones and solemn voices. Neighbors speak of kindness and familiarity. Families cry in public and break down in private. Life insurance forms are signed. A chapter is closed. But elsewhere, often uncomfortably close, the supposedly dead continue to breathe. They watch news coverage of their own disappearance. They hear their names spoken in the past tense. Some attend their own memorials from behind walls or screens. Others flee across borders, carrying nothing but cash, forged documents, and the weight of a lie that must never crack. For a while, the deception works. Days turn into months, months into years. The world adjusts to their absence, yet something subtle begins to shift. Living as a dead person requires more than planning. It demands isolation, restraint, and a willingness to abandon every human tie. No phone calls, no familiar places, no moments of weakness. In a world built on records, transactions, and digital traces, even silence can become suspicious. Every purchase, every movement, every attempt to build a new life leaves a footprint. This documentary is not about celebrating deception. It is about examining the fragile contract between truth and belief. The stories that follow are not legends or rumors, but documented attempts to break free from consequence by manipulating our deepest assumptions about loss and finality. As we move through these lives, one by one, a larger pattern will emerge. Not just how these deceptions were constructed, but why they unraveled. Not just how people fooled the world, but what it cost them and those they left behind. If death defines the end of a story, what happens when that ending is false? And more importantly, what does it reveal about the limits of escape in a world that remembers everything? It started with a red canoe and a man who simply vanished into the sea. March 2002, Seaton Carew, England. A small seaside town where waves break with quiet persistence and the cold waters of the North Sea churn with secrets. John Darwin, a prison officer and experienced canoer, paddled out from the shoreline and never came back. Days later, pieces of his bright red canoe were found along the coast, battered and broken. The conclusion was swift and tragic. He had drowned in the sea he knew so well. His wife Anne grieved publicly. His sons mourned deeply. Friends embraced the loss with sympathy and disbelief. Death, it seemed, had struck quickly and cleanly. A memorial was held, life insurance paid out, and the town closed the book on a story that felt haunting but familiar. But John Darwin wasn't in the sea. He was in the house next door. Behind a wardrobe, a hidden doorway led to a secret bedsit, a small, quiet apartment connected to the Darwin family home. For 5.5 years, John lived there, moving between rooms through concealed passageways, watching the world believe in his absence. He watched his own funeral on television. He listened as his sons, genuinely devastated, spoke of their loss. He was a ghost, not in spirit, but by design. Anne played her part with chilling precision. The grieving widow, the brave survivor. She gave interviews, attended church, even dated other men to deflect suspicion, all while sharing whispers and bank transfers with the husband she claimed to have lost. The plan was cruel, but calculated. They let their sons suffer, not from malice, but from the cold arithmetic of a con. The death was a tool. The grief was collateral. The life insurance policy, worth $250,000, was the bait. And for a while, it worked. But faking death is easier than faking life. By 2007, the Darwins were restless. Panama called with its promises of sunshine and reinvention. They bought property, started a canoe rental business, a darkly ironic twist on John's supposed demise. But bureaucracy doesn't forget. When Darwin needed a visa, he appeared at a police station in London, claiming amnesia. His story. He had no memory of the past 5 years. It was an awkward resurrection, delivered with too much hope and too little plausibility. The truth cracked open fast. Investigators found evidence of his false identity. Financial records linked him to Anne throughout his supposed death. But the final blow came from the past itself. A photo taken in Panama showing John and Anne together in 2006, smiling, alive, unburied. The House of Lies collapsed. Both were arrested. John received 6 years in prison. Anne, 6.5. But the harshest judgment came from their sons, who disowned them, cutting the last thread that had once held the illusion together. This was not a story of genius or villainy. It was a story of ordinary desperation, cloaked in extraordinary deception. The Darwins wanted a reset. They chose disappearance over honesty, pain over redemption. And in the process, they turned their family into actors in a play none had agreed to join. It raises a question that echoes louder than the fraud. How much suffering are we willing to cause in pursuit of freedom? When grief becomes a tool and memory a mask, we find ourselves staring at something colder than death, a life built on betrayal, hiding just next door. What if a man walked into the ocean and simply never came back? Miami Beach, 1974. The sun was dipping low over the Atlantic as British politician John Stonehouse took his final walk into the surf. He left behind a neatly folded pile of clothes on the sand: trousers, shirt, watch, wallet. The implication was unmistakable: a tragic drowning, a moment of weakness, or perhaps an accident, a life swept out to sea. The world responded with the solemn rituals of loss. Stonehouse was not just any man. He was a former Postmaster General, a Member of Parliament, a name in British politics. News headlines mourned his passing. His wife Barbara offered a composed but broken-hearted front to the media. The US Coast Guard combed the waters. British officials sent condolences. The narrative was complete. But the waves hadn't taken John Stonehouse. A plane had. As the sun set on Miami, Stonehouse was already airborne, traveling under a stolen identity. His destination, Australia. His plan, vanish from his troubled life and become someone else entirely. For months, he had been preparing. Multiple fake passports, each crafted from the identities of recently deceased men whose lives had ended quietly, without much notice. Bank accounts, background stories, forged documents, the kind of detail that only desperation could inspire. Stonehouse wasn't running from a single scandal. He was running from a web of secrets: financial collapse, mounting debts, accusations of espionage, and political ruin. In Melbourne, he began again as Joseph Markham, a fictional man with just enough reality to pass. He rented an apartment, set up shop, built a new life from the ashes of his old one. For a brief time, it worked. The headlines faded. His face receded from memory. In a pre-digital world, disappearance still had a chance, but fate has a sense of irony. Australian intelligence was on the hunt for another vanished Brit, the infamous Lord Lucan, suspected of murder and on the run. When they saw a man in Melbourne making unusual bank transactions and matching Lucan's description, they moved in. On December 24, 1974, they arrested him, only to realize they had accidentally captured John Stonehouse, the supposedly dead MP. Fingerprint analysis sealed the revelation. Stonehouse alive. The hoax exposed. What followed was a public unraveling. Investigators dug into his finances, discovering embezzlement, fraud, and layers of deceit. He was extradited to the UK, where charges stacked up like unpaid bills: theft, deception, betrayal of public trust. Even darker shadows emerged: allegations that Stonehouse had been feeding information to check intelligence during his political career. He was sentenced to 7 years in prison. His political career, legacy, and marriage were left in ruins. The final irony? If he had simply faced the storm of scandal, he might have faded with some dignity. Instead, his attempt to vanish made him unforgettable. The Stonehouse saga is not just a tale of a man faking his death. It's a parable about ego and escape, a reminder that reinvention without reckoning always carries a cost. For Stonehouse, the fantasy of rebirth drowned not in the Atlantic, but in the cold exposure of truth. When the ocean is used as a curtain, what remains behind it is rarely washed clean. What if a man crashed a plane, but wasn't on board when it hit the ground? January 11th, 2009. The skies over Indiana were calm, as Marcus Schrenker, a well-dressed financial advisor, lifted off in his private Piper PA-46 aircraft. He told air traffic control he was bound for Florida. 30 minutes into the flight, a distress call crackled through the radio. Cabin pressure failure, pilot incapacitation, a voice trembling with urgency. Then, silence. The plane kept flying, straight, steady, unresponsive. Hours later, it crashed into a swampy stretch of Florida wilderness, torn apart on impact. No pilot was found. The wreckage suggested catastrophe. Investigators braced for another tragic story of mechanical failure and a life lost too soon. But Marcus Schrenker was already on the ground, running. He had parachuted out mid-flight. The crash wasn't a tragedy, it was theater. For months, Schrenker had seen the walls closing in. His investment firm was under investigation. He was accused of stealing millions from clients, some of whom had entrusted him with their life savings. Lawsuits loomed, licenses were revoked, bankruptcy was certain. Faced with financial and personal ruin, he chose to vanish. The plan was meticulous. He had hidden supplies across state lines, cash, maps, gear. He had trained for survival and escape. He even stashed a motorcycle near the flight path, hidden in the woods, ready for a quick getaway. After bailing out of the plane, he made his way through rural Alabama forests, his parachute abandoned, his face scrubbed from public view. He planned to surface later, claiming amnesia, a lost identity, maybe a new life abroad. But modern investigations don't rest on surface impressions. Radar logs told a different story. The aircraft's door had opened mid-flight, a red flag. The lack of a body at the crash site raised more. Searchers found his abandoned motorcycle just where it shouldn't have been. Then came the final clue. Financial traces, bank withdrawals, purchases, digital footprints from a man supposed to be dead. Within 48 hours, federal agents tracked him to a campsite in Alabama. Hidden in a tent, surrounded by cash, camping gear, and forged documents, Schrenker's escape collapsed in silence. He was arrested without resistance. The courtroom would later hear the full story: the fraud, the betrayal of clients, the elaborate flight from justice. Schrenker was sentenced to over 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to those he had deceived. But perhaps the most haunting detail was this. During his escape, Schrenker watched news reports about his own death. He saw images of wreckage and speculation, heard the grief and confusion in the voices of those who believed he was gone. It was the moment the fantasy became too real and reality too strange. Faking death by air is not easy. Gravity does not forgive, nor does trust. This story is more than a tale of financial fraud. It is a portrait of a man who believed he could slip through the cracks of consequence by constructing the perfect crash. But the sky, like the truth, leaves no place to hide. In a world where movement is tracked and data never dies, the fall is not measured in altitude, but in how far one is willing to go to escape themselves. What if a man left a note on a bridge and the world believed he jumped? June 9, 2008. The Bear Mountain Bridge stretched quietly over the Hudson River as morning commuters passed by. But parked along the side was a black SUV, its driver's door ajar. On the dashboard, a handwritten note: "Suicide is painless." The vehicle belonged to Samuel Israel III, once a hedge fund manager, now a convicted fraud facing 22 years in federal prison for orchestrating a $450 million Ponzi scheme. His sentencing loomed. His future was a cell. But to the world that morning, he had vanished into the river. Rescue teams mobilized. The Hudson, with its deep currents and unforgiving cold, became the center of an urgent search. Boats, helicopters, divers, hours turned to days. His body was never found, which wasn't surprising. The river was known to keep its dead. Grief, disbelief, and speculation swirled. News outlets covered the dramatic end of a disgraced financier. His family mourned publicly. Investors, some of whom had lost their life savings, were left with a strange cocktail of closure and confusion. Tragedy, it seemed, had swallowed justice whole. But Samuel Israel wasn't dead. He was in a motorhome. Tucked away in a Massachusetts campground, Israel hid among ordinary travelers, a man out of time and identity. He had planned the whole thing. The note, the car, the emotional cues as a smokescreen, a disappearing act to avoid prison and flee the country. He hoped the media storm would die down, the search would stall, and his freedom would begin elsewhere, perhaps in Europe or South America. The plan might have worked, except Israel couldn't stay hidden from himself. Instead of waiting out the storm, he made contact, a call to a friend, a plea to an ex-girlfriend for help. Desperation eroded discipline. He asked her for fake documents, cash, a way out. She called the FBI. 22 days after he was presumed dead, federal agents walked quietly through the campground, opened the door to a modest RV, and found Israel inside, alive, unshaven, surrounded by supplies, maps, and false IDs. The lie had lasted just over 3 weeks. Back in court, the truth became heavier than any prison sentence. Israel's staged suicide was not only a failure, it was an insult. To the justice system, to the families who grieved, to the investors already broken by his fraud. He didn't buy himself freedom, only added years to his sentence. 22 in total. The bridge, the note, the river, they weren't symbols of despair. They were props in a performance designed to manipulate human empathy. He didn't want to disappear quietly. He wanted the illusion of tragedy, the mythology of a tormented man undone by guilt. But guilt wasn't the motive. Escape was. In a world of public downfall and personal shame, Israel tried to write a new ending. Instead, he became a cautionary tale, not of suicide, but of the lengths to which the powerful will go to rewrite the narrative when they can no longer control it. The river kept no secrets that day. The real drowning happened in trust, and when the surface finally broke, it revealed not a lost man, but one unwilling to face the tide he had created. What if a father walked into the ocean and let his own son believe he was dead? July 28, 2012. A hot summer day on Jones Beach, Long Island. The kind of day families escape the city heat, setting up umbrellas and chasing waves along the shoreline. Among them was Raymond Roth, a 47-year-old telecommunications worker. He told his wife and teenage son he was going for a swim. The ocean shimmered. He stepped into it and never returned. Panic unfolded quickly. Lifeguards scoured the waves. The Coast Guard launched boats and helicopters. Nothing. No body, no belongings, just the vanishing point where a man had once stood. The sea, vast and unforgiving, became the default culprit. His family grieved. His son, Jonathan, barely a teenager, spoke to reporters with a quivering voice about his father's tragic accident. His wife filed life insurance claims. The community mourned. Another drowning at Jones Beach, all too common, all too real. But Raymond Roth hadn't drowned. He was driving south. By nightfall, he was hundreds of miles away, heading for South Carolina with prepaid credit cards and a plan. Crushed by debt, facing financial ruin, Roth had decided to escape the life he no longer wanted, not through suicide, but through vanishing. His death was paperwork waiting to be signed, insurance payouts ready to be collected, a fresh start funded by a calculated lie. What he didn't expect was his son's intuition. Jonathan couldn't shake a feeling. Something in the story didn't sit right. His grief was real, but so was his doubt. He started researching staged drownings, insurance fraud, disappearances. The puzzle pieces didn't fit. And then a breakthrough: text messages. His father's phone, supposedly lost to the ocean, was suddenly active. Jonathan sent messages, and someone answered. It was his father. With quiet resolve and heartbreak, the teenager contacted police. He worked with investigators, sharing his suspicions, his evidence, his texts. They traced the phone, tracked financial movements. And within weeks, Roth was found in a South Carolina hotel, alive and well, and stunned to be caught not by authorities, but by his own son. The fallout was devastating. Roth was arrested, charged with insurance fraud and filing false reports. But the legal consequences paled in comparison to the emotional ones. His son had loved him, mourned him, and ultimately betrayed the illusion for the sake of truth. It's one thing to fake your own death. It's another to ask a child to bear the weight of your absence, believing they were never enough to make you stay. Raymond Roth chose disappearance over responsibility. He hoped grief would cover his tracks, but in the silence he left behind, suspicion grew. And in that suspicion, a young man became something rare, a seeker of truth, even when the truth shattered his heart. This story is not about drowning. It's about trust and the limits of love when deception takes root. The ocean did not take Raymond Roth, but it almost took his family with him. And when the tide receded, it left behind not a body, but a wound, one that could never be buried. What if the blood at the crash site wasn't human? February 2013. A rural back road in Alabama. Scorched earth, twisted metal. The remains of a motorcycle lying in smoldering ruin. Scattered nearby, a wallet, fragments of clothing, a trail of blood. The scene told a clear story. Clayton Daniels, a 29-year-old construction worker, had died in a violent crash. Local news mourned another tragic accident on a dangerous road. His family wept. His mother spoke lovingly about his passion for motorcycles and the open road. Police sealed off the scene. An investigation was opened, but no body was found. And the blood? It wasn't his. In fact, it wasn't human at all. Daniels had staged the entire crash. The motorcycle had been deliberately wrecked and set ablaze. The blood came from a butchered deer, spilled across the road to sell the illusion of a fatal injury. His wallet, ID, and clothing had been carefully placed, not thrown by impact, but arranged like props in a low-budget drama. The goal? To disappear. He was buried in debt, child support, credit cards, legal troubles, the kind of financial gravity that makes escape feel like the only freedom left. And so he vanished into hiding, just a few miles away, tucked inside his girlfriend's apartment, watching coverage of his own death on the evening news. For days, he lived in the pause between disappearance and discovery. The lie almost held. Police believed the crash was real. Friends mourned. The story was airtight until the details were examined more closely. Forensic investigators began piecing things together. The blood didn't match human DNA. The motorcycle's damage was too precise, its trajectory unnatural. There was no biological evidence consistent with a body being ejected or consumed by fire. The crash was not the chaotic mess of tragedy, but the careful staging of someone trying to mimic chaos. Then came the tip, a neighbor's sighting, a trail of connections. Surveillance followed, and soon investigators knocked on the door of a nearby apartment and found Daniels alive, uninjured, and very much not dead. He was arrested, charged with filing false reports, insurance fraud, and attempting to deceive law enforcement. His hopes of disappearing had lasted less than a week. But what stands out in this story is not the deception, it's the desperation behind it. Daniels wasn't trying to steal millions. He wasn't running from federal agents. He was just a man crushed by obligations he couldn't meet. The fantasy of death offered something that life no longer could, an exit. Yet even the smallest lies, when they involve grief, become too heavy to carry. Staged death doesn't erase debt. It multiplies it, legally, emotionally, morally. For every person who weeps at your absence, the truth becomes a deeper betrayal. Clayton Daniels thought he could vanish with a deer's blood and a burned-out bike. But when grief becomes performance and tragedy becomes strategy, even the smallest cracks can expose the entire illusion. And sometimes, all it takes is a single drop of the wrong blood to reveal the whole truth. What if a man burned his own car and trusted fire to erase himself? A remote stretch of road in North Carolina. A car smolders at the edge of a wooded clearing, flames having reduced it to blackened metal and ash. The vehicle belongs to Benny Wint, a 44-year-old Maryland man. He hasn't been seen since. His wife reports him missing. The wreckage suggests the worst: a fiery accident, total destruction, no remains. Investigators comb through the charred site. No body is found, but the fire was intense. The logic is chillingly simple. Perhaps the blaze was hot enough to leave no trace. It's rare, but not impossible. Wint is declared dead. His wife files for life insurance. Claims totaling $1.7 million begin their slow march through the system. But Benny Wint wasn't dead. He was rebuilding. In another state, under another name, he was working quietly at a construction site. New ID, new job, same man. The plan had been in motion for years. Wint had carefully amassed multiple life insurance policies through different employers. He saw the math. Alive, he was barely making ends meet. Dead, he was worth nearly $2 million. The car crash was designed with forensic ambiguity in mind. No body meant no immediate confirmation, and a burned-out vehicle in a remote area offered just enough doubt to delay hard questions. If he could vanish long enough, the money would come. His wife would collect. Later, they would reunite, rich and reborn. But insurance companies do not rely on sympathy. They rely on suspicion. As the claims moved forward, investigators began asking questions. It wasn't just the fire, it was the silence that followed. Wint had left no digital void. Someone was making purchases. Someone who looked like him was spotted near construction sites. Patterns emerged. Surveillance was launched. Eventually, they found him, very much alive, working under an alias, waiting for the clock to run out on disbelief. Wint was arrested. So was his wife. Both were charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. Their attempt to vanish into the smoke of staged death ended with prison sentences, public disgrace, and no payout. The case reveals something deeper than just financial manipulation. It exposes a strange modern faith in disappearance. The idea that we can still, even now, erase ourselves through fire, water, or distance. That the right kind of loss can become a rebirth. But there's no such thing as a clean slate. Not anymore. Insurance companies employ teams trained specifically to detect staged deaths. Algorithms cross-check purchases. Databases flag the slightest inconsistencies. And while death used to be defined by absence, today it is undone by presence. By a credit card swipe, a surveillance photo, a casual slip of the tongue. Benny Wint believed that fire could consume not just a car, but a name, a past, a life. But in the end, what burned was trust. And what rose from the ashes was not freedom, but a trail of evidence leading straight back to the man who thought he had vanished for good. What if a boat drifted empty, and a powerful man used the current to disappear? 1998, Connecticut. The fishing boat of James Galante, a prominent businessman and local political figure, was found capsized and abandoned off the coast during what was supposed to be a solo outing. His gear was scattered. Damage to the boat suggested a collision, but Galante was nowhere to be found. The sea offered the perfect cover. Deep, cold waters, unpredictable tides. The idea that his body may never be recovered seemed entirely plausible. A tragic accident, it was believed. Galante, a man under mounting legal scrutiny, had drowned. But behind the surface story lay something darker. Galante was facing a sweeping federal investigation into his multi-million-dollar waste management empire, long rumored to have ties to organized crime. RICO charges loomed. Subpoenas multiplied. Prosecutors were building a case that could lock him away for decades. Rather than stand trial, he vanished. His plan was deliberate. The boat was sunk where the waters ran deepest. Evidence was scattered with just enough carelessness to sell the illusion of randomness. Family members began to mourn. Business associates made quiet moves to take control of his assets. Investigations paused. After all, you can't prosecute a dead man. But Galante wasn't dead. He was hiding in a remote cabin in upstate New York, unreachable, disconnected, and still very much involved in the daily operations of his empire. His mistake wasn't staging the death. It was continuing to run the business. Federal investigators began to notice that decisions attributed to others bore Galante's distinct signature. Contracts were still moving through the same channels. Financial flows remained oddly familiar. It was as though the ghost of Galante hadn't let go, because he hadn't. Using encrypted communication and trusted intermediaries, he maintained control. But patterns betray their architects. Surveillance followed. Wiretaps clicked on. And eventually, they traced the signal back to the Adirondacks. The cabin was rustic, hidden by trees and silence. Inside, they found Galante, alive, well, and orchestrating his supposed posthumous empire. He was arrested. His charges now included obstruction, fraud, and fleeing prosecution. Whatever edge he had hoped death would offer evaporated. The truth unraveled in courtrooms and headlines. His fake drowning became yet another layer in the case against him. And while the ocean once seemed to promise a clean disappearance, it ultimately delivered only delay, not escape. Galante's story is a modern parable of power, illusion, and the myth of control. For years, he had operated in the margins of legality, confident that influence and money could bend reality. And when the walls closed in, he tried to vanish into myth. But even in the deepest waters, truth finds a way to rise. Staging death may pause the game, but it doesn't change the rules. And for those who try to cheat the end, the real reckoning often comes not in a courtroom, but in the hollow realization that absence too leaves evidence. What if a mountaintop became the perfect place to vanish? 2007. The Italian Alps. Crisp air, thin and biting. Jagged cliffs stretch across the horizon, dusted with snow. It was here that Dr. Mark Weinberger, a successful Indiana sinus surgeon, was last seen. He told his wife he was going for a solo hike. He never came back. Search teams scrambled across the alpine terrain. Helicopters scanned the rocky peaks. Rescuers combed the trails for days, then weeks. But the landscape was unforgiving, the danger real. The conclusion? He had fallen. Another tragic accident in the wild beauty of Europe. His wife, devastated, returned home alone. But Weinberger wasn't lost. He was hiding. For years, Weinberger had built a medical empire based on deception. Unnecessary surgeries, phantom procedures, inflated insurance claims. Investigators had begun digging into his practice, and what they found was staggering. Tens of millions in fraud, hundreds of patients misled or mistreated. Lawsuits were piling up. Criminal charges were imminent. And so he ran. He had planned the disappearance for months. Bank accounts drained, cash stashed, false identities created. The hike in the Alps wasn't a vacation. It was an exit. While the world believed he had died on a mountaintop, he was slipping deeper into hiding, moving through remote European villages, leaving behind no digital footprint. He lived off the grid, in tents, in secluded cabins, in quiet border towns. From time to time, he would surface briefly, using fake documents to buy supplies, always looking over his shoulder. The illusion of death had bought him time, but it could not buy him peace. The deception began to unravel not through chance, but through persistence. Financial investigators kept pulling at threads. They tracked suspicious withdrawals, identified alias names, followed whispers across borders. European authorities were brought in. A trail, faint but real, began to emerge. And then, one day in 2009, in a remote Italian village, they found him, disheveled, thin, living in a tent, wedged into a rocky hillside. A man who once wore surgical gowns now wore layers of tattered clothing, hunched against the wind. His past had finally caught up. Weinberger was extradited to the United States. In court, his crimes were laid bare, not just fraud, but betrayal of the most sacred trust, the relationship between doctor and patient. He had vanished not to escape death, but to avoid justice. His disappearance had only deepened the harm he had already done. The story of Dr. Weinberger is a stark reminder. Vanishing is not redemption. Faking death doesn't erase the past. It prolongs the reckoning and often intensifies the fall. He had sought to rewrite his ending on the side of a mountain, hoping nature would finish the story he no longer wanted to tell. But nature doesn't grant absolution. In the end, it wasn't the cold that claimed him. It was the truth. And high in those mountains, where the air is thin and echoes last, the lie he told still lingers, as empty and hollow as the trail he left behind. What if a plane disappeared into deep water and its pilot was already gone? The chill of Lake Superior rolled across the northern horizon as a private aircraft slipped from radar. The pilot, David Miller, a hedge fund manager with a reputation for brilliance and a secret too big to hold. On the surface, the flight was routine, but soon it would become a mystery. The plane was discovered in fragments near the lake's rocky shores. The water, dark and vast, offered little in return. No body was recovered. Weather conditions were poor. Crashes happened. Tragedy felt plausible. But this wasn't fate. It was theater. Miller had orchestrated the crash to appear accidental, another name claimed by one of the world's most unforgiving lakes. The story, on its surface, held experienced pilot, sudden malfunction, a body lost in frigid depths, families grieved, business partners panicked, investigators took notes. But beneath the sorrow, something was missing. A man too brilliant to die so clumsily had vanished just as his $100 million Ponzi scheme began to collapse. As investors tried to recover their funds, strange patterns emerged: account activity where there should be none, withdrawals from places Miller had never been, rumors, sightings, inconsistencies. He hadn't disappeared into the lake. He'd parachuted out, slipped across the Canadian border using a false identity, and was now hiding in plain sight. The fraud was massive, a labyrinth of falsified returns and stolen trust. Miller had promised his clients security, growth, and control, but in the end, he offered them only silence. His exit plan relied on nature's vastness and the human willingness to believe in disaster over deceit. But what he hadn't accounted for was how quickly belief erodes under scrutiny. Canadian border agents, trained to spot forged documents, noticed inconsistencies. A man with no past, using credentials that belonged to the recently dead, traveling without purpose. They flagged his identity, alerted authorities, and suddenly the crash that once seemed tragic now seemed strategic. When Miller was found, he was not in hiding. He was in motion, attempting to establish a new life, funded by stolen investments and shielded by a faked death. But the deeper investigators dug, the more the illusion fell apart. Financial records, forged documents, burner phones, all tools of a man who believed disappearance could erase betrayal. He was arrested, extradited, and tried. The court heard every detail: the scheme, the flight, the false ending. Victims spoke of retirement savings gone. College funds vanished, futures collapsed. The plane crash had taken no lives but had shattered hundreds. Miller was sentenced to years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution that would never be recovered in full. His name became shorthand for one of the boldest financial frauds and one of the most brazen escapes in recent memory. This wasn't just about greed. It was about the fantasy that death, even faked, could offer absolution. But Lake Superior, deep as it is, could not hide the truth. It held no body. And in that absence, investigators found the beginning of a different story, one not about death, but about accountability delayed. David Miller tried to vanish into myth. Instead, he landed in history, a cautionary tale of a man who thought he could fly above consequence, only to be brought down by the weight of the lives he ruined. What if someone tried to live as a ghost in the house next door? In the quiet coastal town of Seaton Carew, England, where the sea fog rolls in thick and the streets whisper of old stories, John Darwin became a legend not through disappearance, but through proximity. His was not a tale of exotic escapes or distant hideouts. His hiding place was unimaginably close. Behind a wardrobe, through a hidden door, John Darwin lived in secret for over 5 years, in a house connected to the one where his family grieved. Revisiting his story now, it feels more like a parable than a crime. A man stages a canoeing accident, allows the sea to take the blame, and lets the world believe he drowned. His wife mourns in public, claims insurance, accepts sympathy. His sons weep with genuine grief. And all the while, he listens, watches, waits. There is something particularly haunting about Darwin's version of faked death. Most who vanish try to put distance between themselves and their old lives. But Darwin remained tethered, invisible but present. He attended his own absence like a curator. The proximity added layers of cruelty. He was close enough to comfort his wife, yet distant enough to traumatize his children. His downfall wasn't driven by sudden exposure, but by gradual ambition. For years, the illusion held, until the couple dreamed bigger: a new life in Panama, a canoe rental business, a fresh chapter far from British shores. But dreams require documents, and documents require identity. So John Darwin walked into a police station in 2007 and claimed he had amnesia. He couldn't recall where he'd been for the past 5 years. He was ready, he said, to return to life. But life didn't wait. Investigators uncovered financial records, property deeds, and, damningly, a photograph from Panama. John and Anne Darwin, smiling together, very much alive, 4 years after his supposed death. The illusion dissolved in an instant. The final proof was not forensic, but photographic. Both were convicted. The legal reckoning came quickly. The moral reckoning came from their sons, who publicly disowned them. Their grief turned to something colder than anger: betrayal. John Darwin's story is less about escape than it is about the cost of proximity to a lie. He didn't just fake his death, he haunted his own family. The grief he watched unfold wasn't just collateral damage, it was the fuel that kept his illusion alive. In the end, Darwin's hoax wasn't unraveled by technology or error. It unraveled because even the most carefully buried secrets rot when kept too close to home. To live as a dead man is to erase oneself from the world. But to do so from the shadows of your own living room is to commit an erasure that echoes in every wall, every footstep, every silence. There are few prisons more confining than the one you build yourself, especially when it's behind the door you forgot to lock. And when truth finally knocks, it doesn't just break the illusion, it breaks the house in two. What if pretending to die meant giving up everything that made you alive? Each of the stories we've explored, the canoeist, the financier, the surgeon, the politician, share the same skeleton: a vanishing act, a carefully crafted illusion, a life paused to avoid the inevitable. But what lies beneath the surface is not strategy or cleverness. It's something far more human: desperation. For those who fake their deaths, the motivations are as varied as their methods. Crushing debt, legal peril, shame, a longing for reinvention. Sometimes it's greed, sometimes it's fear, but always it's escape, and escape is never free. To disappear, you must first erase bank accounts, social connections, digital fingerprints. Every trace of a life built over decades must be cut away. Friends are abandoned. Children are left grieving. Spouses become actors in stories they never agreed to perform. And for what? A life on the run? A tent on a hillside? A burner phone in a motel room? The constant hum of paranoia? The inability to speak your own name without consequence? Living as a ghost among the living is not freedom. It is exile. There is a mythology around disappearance. The romantic idea that you can shed your skin and become someone new. That out there, beyond the reach of bills and betrayal, there's a version of yourself untouched by mistake. But the reality is colder. New identities require lies. Lies require maintenance. And the modern world is a hostile place for phantoms. Cameras watch highways. Phones ping towers. Money leaves trails. The systems we've built to connect and protect us have become the very nets that catch us when we run. And when these schemes fall apart, as they all do, the collapse is rarely quiet. Families feel the blow twice, once in the initial grief and again in the betrayal. Children who mourned come to realize they were made into props. Spouses who defended a memory discover they were accomplices or worse, victims. The pain deepens. The wound reopens, this time with no clear name for what was lost. What makes these stories so haunting isn't just the deception, it's the intimacy of it. The way these false deaths turn love into a liability, trust into a tool, grief into a mask. And yet, there's a strange commonality in the endings. None of these individuals disappeared forever. They were all found, not by magic or accident, but by small details, a transaction, a text, a photo, a familiar decision made in an unfamiliar name. In the end, they didn't fail because they were foolish. They failed because they were human. They missed the people they left. They wanted to be seen. They reached out. And in doing so, they broke the one rule of the dead. Don't look back. This chapter of our story is not about any one person. It is the moment where the illusion collapses, not with sirens or handcuffs, but with a whisper, "I'm still here." Because even the most perfect vanishing act can't extinguish the simplest truth. We want to be known, even when we don't want to be found. What does it mean to vanish in a world that never forgets? We began with a question. Can someone truly erase themselves? Legally, socially, emotionally, and still keep living? The stories we've followed, from canoes to cabins, from plane crashes to bridges, all suggest the same haunting answer. Yes, but only for a while. The modern world does not permit easy disappearances. Our lives are mapped in data, in transactions, in cameras, and keystrokes. We leave behind trails even when we try not to. And when someone attempts to vanish, what they're really doing is choosing exile over reckoning, silence over truth, a lie over the messy, painful work of facing what's broken. And yet, the desire to vanish endures. Maybe it always has. In myths, it was the hero who faked death to trick fate. In folklore, the sailor lost at sea returned with a new name and a distant past. In modern times, it's the debtor, the criminal, the man at the end of his rope, all grasping at disappearance as a final form of freedom. But the price is always the same. You lose your name, your history. The love people once gave you freely becomes a debt you can never repay. And when you are finally found, because you always are, you return not as the person they lost, but as the person who lied. There's no insurance policy for that kind of damage. For the families left behind, the deception lingers long after the arrest. A funeral that never should have happened. A grief that was real, even if the death was not. The deepest cut isn't the lie itself. It's that their pain was used as cover. And for those who staged their deaths, none gained what they hoped for. Not peace, not escape, not rebirth, just a second sentence, often harsher than the first. Prison terms, ruined reputations, estranged families, and an enduring label, not just fraud, but betrayer. In a way, their stories are mirrors. They show us what happens when the fantasy of escape collides with the hard edges of reality. When the fear of failure becomes greater than the will to fix things. When a human being believes, for a moment, that vanishing is better than facing the truth of who they are. But maybe the deeper truth, the one that lingers after the headlines fade, is this: we all disappear in small ways, in regrets unspoken, in relationships neglected, in the quiet avoidance of responsibility. And yet, the path to redemption, however slow or painful, is still open as long as we remain present. To disappear is easy. To return is harder. To stay and to repair is hardest of all. In the end, these stories remind us not of death, but of the living, of our need to be seen, to be forgiven, to begin again, without lies, without masks, without the false comfort of disappearance. Because in this interconnected world, the most radical act isn't vanishing, it's staying and choosing to be known, even when it hurts.